Hi, this is Philip Roberts submitting my vlog for my Game Designer's Cultural Practice class at Georgia Tech. This week we'll be exploring mechanics as metaphors, failure, and the Save the Princess trope, and the game we'll be critiquing is Braid. Braid tells a story about a young man named Tim who has just broken up with his girlfriend. This is told to the player through the use of several books laid between levels throughout the game. The various mechanics and interactions throughout the game heavily emphasize the themes of this breakup and how it's affected Tim. The mechanics of the game combine simple platforming with various time manipulation abilities. There is no death in Braid, or rather, nothing permanent. Whenever you encounter an obstacle or an enemy, you do die. However, you're able to rewind time to quickly put you back in place before you've suffered the hazard. This mechanic of rewinding time to undo your mistakes forms the core metaphor of Braid. Just as Tim is retracing his steps throughout a failed relationship, you too go back to undo the mistakes of your past. It's only by doing so that you're able to further progress. There are many points in the game where you're introduced to various objects that are manipulated differently through time. For example, 2 doors have to be unlocked by a key. Although your key is destroyed on its first use, one of these doors is unaffected by you rewinding time, meaning you get a second use out of the key and are able to progress. This is a small example of the underlying philosophy of Braid's puzzle design. As you progress throughout the game, you'll be introduced to different worlds, where new mechanics are introduced within the context of that world. For example, you may have a ring that slows down time in a certain area, or you may have a shadow you that retraces the steps you just did before. Fair warning, Braid does get fairly tricky at several points, requiring a fair amount of skill in both platforming and problem solving to be able to progress. However, for the most part, the puzzles are fair, giving you a great aha moment figuring it out, with only a few frustrating exceptions. The audio in Braid is somewhat simple, although very functional and provides adequate feedback throughout the play. There's a satisfying smack whenever you jump on an enemy and one of them hits you, providing good feedback throughout the various interactions and gameplay. The mellow violin track that plays throughout most of the game even performs a certain form of feedback. Whenever you manipulate time, the soundtrack either reverses or speeds up however you are manipulating it. Moving on to the visuals. Again, there are some good metaphors being used here, however a couple of missed opportunities as well. Braid is very visually pretty, with lush environments and blue skies, although as we progress into the darkness of the story, the visuals too get darker. We see that Braid borrows heavily from other platformers, especially Mario, and here's where our visuals again cross over with the narrative of Braid. At first, Tim comes across as a rather sympathetic character, young and unsure of himself. His goal is quite simply to save his princess in a castle. However, by playing through Braid, we can see how this begins to unwind. We're told the story through Tim's perspective, who portrays himself as hurt and misunderstood, but through his ruminating, we reveal the cracks in the facade. More and more, Tim comes across as a very immature and uncertain person. By idolizing his fiancée, Tim never really sees her for who she is, and by being stuck in his juvenile fantasies, he slowly loses the one who's precious to him. Thus, Braid turns the Save the Princess trope on its head. In many ways, Tim may be meant to represent the players who grew up with games such as Mario. Rather than live in the real world, Tim is preoccupied with his fantasies within his own head. This leads him to avoid his problems and have difficulty with his personal relationships, such as his parents and his fiancée. We see by the end of Braid that Tim, rather than being some poor, misunderstood person, Tim is very immature and has some very fundamentally flawed ideas about relationships. With how the various tropes are being used throughout Braid, here perhaps the creator is poking some fun at video games themselves, which are often built around these very juvenile and destructive themes. Having played through Braid before, there's a great twist at the end that adds more context to the narrative, not merely through text, but also through gameplay. This is especially strong because instead of being told through you, which is probably one of the weaknesses of Braid, the story is shown through the interactions and mechanics.